Hello and welcome. Today's event continues the conversation from our recent HILT conference on championing equitable instruction and inclusive classrooms. Our session is titled How to Talk About Far-Right Extremism and Disinformation in the Classroom. It can be increasingly difficult to talk about pressing social issues in the classroom, especially as political polarization, disinformation, and extremism take over public conversations. Students often rely on social media, particularly YouTube and TikTok, to form their opinions, which is why educators should be aware of the range of discussions happening on these contentious topics. Even knowing how to talk about social functions of conspiracies or media practices like news gathering and sourcing can help defuse difficult classroom situations. During our conversation, Dr. Joan Donovan will speak about her experiences teaching about media manipulation, white supremacist extremism, and disinformation, and provide some tips for addressing them. Dr. Joan Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Joan leads the field in examining internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. She also leads the Technology and Social Change Project, or TaSC, which explores how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. TaSC conducts research, develops methods, and facilitates workshops for journalists, policymakers, technologists, and civil society organizations on how to detect, document, and debunk media manipulation campaigns. Dr. Donovan teaches a graduate-level course in media manipulation and disinformation campaigns with a focus on how social movements, political parties, governments, corporations, and other network groups engage in active efforts to shape media narratives and disrupt social institutions. Her research can be found in a wide range of academic books and peer-reviewed journals, as well as such media outlets as NPR, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, and more. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, Joan was the research lead for Data and Society's Media Manipulation Initiative, where she led a large team of researchers studying efforts to manipulate socio-technical systems for political gain. Dr. Donovan received her PhD in Sociology and Science Studies from the University of California, San Diego, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics, where she studied white supremacists' use of DNA ancestry tests, social movements, and technology. Without further ado, let's begin our discussion of extremism and disinformation. Joan, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's truly an experience to be able to talk about this with this group of folks. And please don't hesitate to put questions in the Q&A as we get rolling here. I'll try to keep an eye on it. So the shorter and more brief you can be, the easier it is for me to kind of incorporate it into what we're going to be talking about here. But there'll be plenty of room for questions after I roll through some of the material. And I'm going to share my screen here just because I've prepared some slides. I started at the Kennedy School thinking about research, doing a lot of research on white supremacist groups and media manipulation, disinformation campaigns. And the wonderful folks at the Kennedy School offered me an opportunity to teach a class, bringing in literature from sociology, communication studies, technology and philosophy, some data science, a heavy bit of research about journalism, but then also brought in some journalists themselves. And what I tried to do was set up a classroom environment of where people felt really comfortable discussing with one another the issues of the day. Of course, for the last several years, disinformation has become a very hot topic, as has the rise in extremism in the US, especially white supremacist or white power groups. And that can be really difficult for younger folks to talk about without feeling as if they're being personally attacked just for asking questions. And so what I've tried to do is work within a set of guidelines and a set of materials that help move the classroom discussion along, but don't allow, any particular trope to take over. It can be particularly hard at the Kennedy School because everybody's got a political opinion. And so one of the things I try to establish early on is, well, what counts as evidence in the classroom isn't going to be the same thing that counts as evidence when you're hanging out with your friends. And so, the motto of trust but verify has been something that has led me out of some particularly prickly conversations, especially as students want to learn more about race and gender and culture, religion, and how that impacts politics and our political worldviews. As an educator, your role is to guide them through those questions and get them to not just rely on what they knew before they came into the classroom, but to actually learn something. And so for my students, I've really tried to cultivate an attitude about learning, which is that you don't come to the classroom already knowing everything you need to know about media manipulation, disinformation, and extremism. So I'll give you a few definitions of things that might help you in your classroom get beyond, partisan talking points and into the mechanics of understanding what's happening in our current moment as, we've kind of been deluged by an abundance of lies, especially in our online environments. And I don't think it's necessarily even fair to tell students to just read the Washington Post or just read the New York Times. I think we actually have to cultivate media literacy and an approach to understanding news gathering and bias so that they realize that when we talk about politics, we're actually really talking about media about politics. Now, I know at the Kennedy School, a few of us probably related to politicians. And so you are a little bit more, as we would talk in technology studies, you're close to the metal. That is, you're in it. But for most of us, we glean our information about politics based on a kind of bricolage or a mosaic of media sources that we put together. And then, it kind of feels like true or, counts as true if we've been able to see the same information a few different places at a few different outlets and then verify it, of course. However, with social media, it also introduces a lot of confusion because repetition is part of the design. And therefore, it can actually be disarming for many of our students who will say, well, I saw it on Facebook, I saw it on TikTok. I saw it here, there, and everywhere. And you have to kind of help them understand what's at stake there. I'm getting a few questions about unbiased news organizations. That's a rabbit hole that you should talk with your students through. I take it on a story by story basis, which is I try to get the students to understand, well, how long has passed since this story came out? We're always going to know more the longer a story is in play. And so if it's in a breaking news situation and you can show them, hey, we're only 4 hours out of learning this information, it's going to be a while before we know something more true. And so those are the kinds of ways in which I try to get them to think about news as a process. But there is, every news organization does exhibit some kind of political bias or bias related to the kinds of topics they tend to cover. And that has a lot to do with who they hire and who works there and who's on what beat. And so those dynamics, though, are things that you can understand. And resources, I always go to Pointer when I need information about different news outlets or information about the kind of like goings on of journalism. Poynter is how it's spelled. So Donovan's law of disinformation. This is a joke, but it's kind of true still, which is there's no communication without misinformation. So that is an important thing to understand in our classrooms. Specifically because we don't want students to show up and feel wrong because they're asking questions about things that we assume are misinformation, or we don't want to approach it to suggest that they're misinformed. What we actually want to do is recognize that in every question, there is inquisitiveness, and so we want to dig a little bit deeper. Sometimes students will not approach it with a question, so sometimes I will just reorient them and say, "Can you phrase that in the form of a question?" Because sometimes they want to get a point across, and so there are ways in which we can disarm how they're going to talk about misinformation by just setting some ground rules around what it is they're trying to get at, and why specifically in moments of heavy news, like what we went through with the, for instance, the rise of white supremacist groups and the violence at the Capitol, people want explanations, and students are taking in a ton of media to try to understand it, but their media and the media that other people consume are going to be very different. There was a great article in the markup showing just differences in red feeds and blue feeds on Facebook during the Capitol insurrection, and how in red feeds there was this one very false story claiming that facial recognition had identified Antifa at the Capitol, and therefore the reader should not assume that these are Trump supporters storming the Capitol. That lie was later repeated by Rep. Matt Gaetz on the floor of Congress later when they were certifying the votes. And then the company that was named in the fake news article had to get the article's author to issue a retraction. Someone's asking, what does red feed and blue feed mean? So your news feeds on Facebook, you can, we all have our own partisan likes and dislikes. But what the markup was able to do as a journalism outfit was set up an account that really was a sort of a heavy Democrat feed, which is the blue feed, and then the red feed was one that was more conservative news based. But you could see in the media environments the actual definition of what was happening in real time was being shaped differently for different audiences. And I want you to understand that that is an effect of the personalization that we experience by using social media to get news and information. Great question. So a few definitions. When we talk about media manipulation, we use a very broad category of media to talk about an artifact of communication. So it could be notes from a meeting, it could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a post you see online, it could be a meme, it could be a documentary, it could be AM radio, anything that is the leave behinds of communication. We talk about as media. And then when we talk about manipulation, though, we talk about to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. And we leave the word artful in there because artists and activists and others for years have used media manipulation as a tactic to unveil something dangerous or troublesome about our world. So hoaxing the media in particular, or hoaxing mainstream news organizations, is a familiar tactic that actually I wrote about in Scientific American as coming from activists on the left who knew that anybody could register a domain online. And so in the 90s, there were these activists called the Yes Men that decided, well, we could just pretend to be the World Trade Organization. Nobody's stopping us from buying this domain. We could pretend to be George W. Bush's website. And that's, ways in which media manipulators think about leveraging the design features of our open internet in order to hoax or produce news or to trick or deceive audiences is really something that over the last 20 years has come into fashion in a way that is well, at this point, it's incredibly problematic and is, maybe a meme war will take down the government. Who knows? But it certainly is, a serious problem when our open communication infrastructure is being used by media manipulators to disinform at scale. And so I wouldn't fault students or any of us for getting it wrong at this stage, because there are actually very few guardrails that ensure the information that we're getting through search and social media is true and correct. In fact, the information environment is tilted to the advantage of media manipulators who often will use techniques like spoofing. That is, they'll pretend to be someone that they're not, or they'll use fake accounts in order to make you believe that they're the New York Times or the AP. And so students sometimes won't be able to assess those cloaked websites or those cloaked accounts as easily as we might hope. And journalists too are often tricked into amplifying misinformation without any, unwittingly. Even when they've tried to vet it and check it, sometimes the problem is that good. We'll get into this question about misinformation and disinformation now. So misinformation is just the sharing of false information, very big, broad buckets. Disinformation, though, is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. And why that matters is because what we try to do as a research team is be able to assess, and you can go to our website, mediamanipulation.org, to see the kind of research that we do. It's completely open access and available for everyone. I have a very high commitment these days to making sure public knowledge about this field of disinformation is available across all professional sectors, which is exactly why I wanted to do this VPAL event, because I think it's important that we all understand what's happening here. And so when we're thinking about disinformation, though, what we're trying to do is assess, where does the information come from? And is it part of some kind of network of, in some cases, white supremacists, some cases, political operatives, some cases, foreign operatives. That's why you hear Russia so much in the press. Is this information kind of being forced into our public conversation? And if so, can we figure out how, right? So that's what we do as a research team, is try to understand media manipulation, disinformation. But if you know a little bit about how that works, you can be a little bit more of a savvy media consumer. And at the end, I'll give you a list of journalists that you should follow. And if you just follow these few key journalists, you'll kind of be up to date day by day about what's happening on the dystopia beat, as we call it. But when we're talking about online extremism, I think this is really important to understand, because your students are not necessarily going to understand the things that are like something racist happened on the internet versus actual organized white power movements. And so they're going to oscillate in their understanding of what's happening, because they're not going to really be able to figure out, well, what's the difference between, a college frat that throws a party where people show up in blackface. That happens every year at many different universities. Nevertheless, it's a kind of moment in which people learn about other cultures, or, conversations that we have about appropriate Halloween costumes and how it's not a good idea in any way to culturally appropriate the signs and symbols of other cultures, especially ones that are used in important ceremonies or rituals in order to make a joke. But when we're talking about online extremism, we're not really talking about that kind of stuff. What we're talking about is a repeated pattern of behavior where the user or group uses websites and social media to spread a worldview of white supremacy and intolerance. So what this could look like is a website that is maintained. For instance, the Proud Boys used to have a pretty unique website for a while that sold racist T-shirts. some of them more abhorrent than the last. Some were hard to figure out. The ones that said RWDS, not many people understood what that meant. It meant right-wing death squad. We saw pictures of people at the Capitol with the T-shirt that just said hashtag 6W or 6MWE, which means 6 million were not enough, right? And so that's an anti-Semitic nod to the Holocaust. And so, so this is a good question about talking about extremism without necessarily legitimizing what these groups stand for. I think it's important that we all have a similar kind of knowledge about what is at stake when we try to talk about the left and the right in any kind of balanced way, especially when we're talking about right-wing, I like to call it online extremism or far-right extremism, but there's no denying that what happened at the Capitol had a kind of post-apocalyptic feel to it because of the influence of Christian white nationalism. There was a great article written in the New York Times about this, where people really did believe this was the end of days and that Judgment Day was upon them and that they should bring this, gallows noose to the Capitol, and literally people wanted to hang Mike Pence. And so when we're talking about in the classroom, it's really important not to deflect and turn away from what's actually happening in the news and what the questions they have are, and try to set up some kind of false equivalence between anti-fascist organizing, which can be violent and it can be insurrectionary. But at the same time, you don't want to confuse the two, especially in this moment where the reason why we had such a growing white nationalist movement over the last 4 years had a lot to do with the political environment in which they felt like they were winning. And, you look at policies around, for instance, if you look at policies around the Muslim ban, or, immigration policies about the border wall or the build the wall chants that were very frequent at Trump rallies. It's just really important to understand those dynamics. People are asking why to call out the definition of extremism for white supremacy. It's really important to understand that this online extremism argument that I'm making is very particular to the far right. When it comes to other forms of extremism, they don't have this same kind of high touch social media presence as other groups. Anti-fascist organizers often will meet in person and they will have local chapters, and they don't use the internet in the same way to spread ideas and to do recruitment. However, there are more fascist podcasts than there are hours in the day. There's more content put online by folks that for a while were calling themselves the alt-right, but have now splintered into a bunch of different factions. And so I am calling attention to that specific mode of engagement on social media, especially as it materialized over the last few months in Stop the Steal rallies, that the ones that were not as well documented as the Capitol siege, but I'm talking about events on particularly December 12th that happened in DC, where the Proud Boys stole Black Lives Matter banners and then burned them on live stream. And if you were in that moment watching those live streams, there were tens of thousands of people watching this happen. And there was lots of references to the KKK and that imagery of violence. And so that's why I make those distinctions. And that's why our research focuses on online extremism as it relates to the US far right. But there's other great research out there that can help you understand other kinds of fundamentalism and the role the internet plays in spreading worldviews. I don't talk so much about recruitment either, because it's not the case that, except for a group like the Proud Boys, it's not the case that people do like have a direct entry point into a radicalized group, but rather it's more in the air, and it's attitudes that people adopt. And disinformation is actually a very potent vector by which students are introduced to far right extremism online. I hope I satisfied. We can get into self-care later, but I get 2 therapists. It's all good. Another thing you should be attentive to, though, is networked conspiracy. This is something that we've been doing research on related to. Rob Ferris has written a book called Networked Propaganda. He's on my team. And Brian Friedberg has written a few explainers on QAnon, one specifically for Wired that is fantastic. But networked conspiracies are sort of like urban legends. I mean, we don't always know how we know about certain kinds of urban legends, but their network conspiracies provide moral tales that explain confusing events. And one of the ways to think about networked conspiracies is really about how do you think about social media, which is to say that they tend to go viral. And depending upon who the influencers are that are bringing these conspiracy theories around the web and through different social media, they have 2 incentives usually. One is financial. That is, if you can sell t-shirts, or you can get donations, or you can get people to subscribe to your podcast or your Patreon, it can make money. So QAnon is an industry. As well, political gains, right? If you are able to advance your political cause based on whatever the breaking news of the day is, you think about the news differently. You actually think about breaking news as an opportunity to piggyback your ideas into mainstream conversation. We saw this very clearly with the QAnon groups that tried to piggyback their idea about the Democrats. God, this is going to sound crazy to say out loud, but Q stands for Q clearance, and it's a military designation, and Anon is QAnon was a screen name on an anonymous message board where there were a whole bunch of different accounts: FBI Anon, White House Confidential. There were a bunch of different people using anonymous message boards to pretend that they were leaking information to the populace. And so QAnon, though, became this phenomenon and this hashtag where people could make money by basically looking at this anonymous message board, taking some screenshots, and then reposting those screenshots either on their Twitter feed, or talking about them in their podcasts, or making a YouTube video, or putting them into a Facebook group or a Reddit discussion. And then they kind of became known as these oracles or these explainers. And where QAnon really takes off as a network conspiracy is during the Epstein scandal. So this trope around Epstein didn't kill himself, this meme that you've probably seen at some point or heard repeated somewhere, that's part of this whole phenomenon we call meme wars, which is meme wars bring ordinary people into contact with disinformation in the form of networked conspiracies. So QAnon, Plandemic is another one you may have seen, Biden crime family. That was the one they were trying to make happen during the leaking of the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco, which was so many moons ago, just back in October. And then, of course, Stop the Steal, which was the animating hashtag that brought together a bunch of different factions to claim that the election had been stolen from Trump by, there were so many different reasons out there. My favorite, though, was communist algorithms, that Venezuela had done it. But that's all to say that these mechanisms are now in play because of our social media information environment. So I just want to give you a couple of guides, and then we will go into Q&A. But here are some quick points that I think you can use as you're teaching or trying to manage discussions or facilitate conversations that are going to be difficult to have around hate speech and disinformation. One, misinformation is everybody's problem now. It's not easy to bracket it out of the conversation, even if you're teaching a math class. Students are curious, and the classroom should be a very safe environment for them to proffer questions. But of course, if they are trolling you, or if they have that glint in their eye, like I'm about to get you, just, you can deflect if you say, well, how is this related to the course material? Look, that's one of my favorites is this related to the topic of discussion today? And so it's not necessarily dismissive. It just makes them work for it when it comes to trying to get explanation or trying to offer up some kind of, I don't know. I've had my share of students try to troll me. It's not an easy situation to navigate. Establish boundaries and standards at the beginning of the course that acknowledge the difficulties in knowing what is true, right? Education is an experience. Education is a struggle. And so I talk to my students about the nature of truth very early on, knowing that truth is contextual, truth is built on, brick by brick. We build the foundation of truth. And so truths that arrive out of nowhere, that don't seem to have basis in what we knew as true the day before, I encourage them to investigate and think more deeply about what they're accepting as truth. All media outlets have a bias, which is why it's important to know how to look at the content of a story and assess its reliability. Talk with students about what counts as evidence in the classroom. So I take it on a story by story basis. Of course, certain news outlets have a good reputation, some don't, but most students are not getting their information from reputable news sources. They're getting their information from social media. And so I think it's important that we just encourage them to trust but verify. Social media makes it hard to know the source of information. So I explained that very early on, that if you're getting your information from Snapchat, for instance, you're going to have to figure out another way to verify and vet what it is that you want to talk about. If students want to reference something on a platform like Twitter or TikTok or Wikipedia, they should also try to confirm that information in other ways. Of course, media outlets do get scoops, but I try to explain to students that journalism is not research. In the same way that research in academia, it takes a much more measured tone and a lot more time, right? And so journalists, I often describe as the first draft of history. And with every first draft, there's going to be some problematic points of contention. As well, talking about hate speech is very difficult, and under no circumstance should anyone use a slur to prove a point. That creates an environment of fear, defensiveness, and confusion, but also of permission, right? And so I do not allow students to use slurs in the classroom. Even things that sometimes I don't feel super comfortable saying on Zoom, we might use code words. It actually helps, in their mind sometimes, like when we were discussing Pizzagate and QAnon in my classroom, with Pizzagate, there was this scandal that every time Podesta and Clinton were ordering pizza, what they were actually ordering was child pornography. And so we would just say cheese pizza, like, let's talk about cheese pizza, and so there are ways in which you can try to soften and lessen the hurt and pain that could be caused by trying to prove a point by saying a slur out loud. I'll tell you, these students can run circles around you with slurs that they know about. And so our job as educators is really to just set the tone and the guidelines and respect that we do not want to set up a culture of permission just because we want students to feel more free in a very, free as in, the context of speech, which is to say that you want to emphasize that free speech is never free from consequences. And I think that that's been something that's really been difficult in the classroom for us to discuss, and I'm happy to get into it. But students need to know that, these are not, this classmates are their colleagues, and colleagues can be pretty brutal. And so we can't actually control what people say about you outside of the classroom if you engage in this kind of behavior. And so that to me is an important thing that students can learn about dignity and respect as they're navigating how to talk about racism, hate speech, the far right, and disinformation in classroom environments. I also stress that when discussing matters of fact and misinformation, it's not an attack on personal identity. And so I might give a preamble in a lecture to say, well, we're going to get into this today. And this is why it matters for the literature. And that the classroom should actually be the place you want to be wrong. It should be the place that you want to stretch your ideas, and you should foster working through issues using course materials as a guide. Talking to them about, well, how does this author, talk about hate speech? How does this author talk about disinformation? How do they convince you that they're right? Right. And so getting them to understand the mechanics and the facilitation of an argument in a academic paper doesn't just make them stronger scholars, it makes them stronger communicators. So I often have students grapple with the way that an author has had to deal with this as they're trying to tread the line between matters of fact and matters of misinformation. And then lastly, and this is something that I would say often in my class, is devil doesn't need an advocate. So everyone must ask questions authentically, that myself included. The point isn't to sit around and pretend that we're a bunch of liberals and that we're, woke and shook by all of these problems. The point isn't to pretend that we're some conservative or libertarian with some major bone to pick with the government. Those are exercises, and those can be staged, and you can do them effectively if you ask students to come to you with their authentic selves, right? And help them understand that there are going to be different biases that are going to shape their points of view, and that addressing those biases are more important than pretending they don't exist or that you are somehow above the fray, because we all get caught up in it. I often get caught up in, you could pretty much tell me anything about Bitcoin at this stage and I'll believe it, because I don't know how to deal with like that kind of conversation, the kind of misinformation about the currency over there, right? So I'm like, I know where my, particular spots are that I'm not going to know what's happening, and so I have to wade into certain topics with a degree of both curiosity but also understanding. And then lastly, I'll just say, I'll put these in the chat as well. These reporters that I have here, Taylor Lorenz at the New York Times is known as being on the meme beat. So she can help you understand Wall Street bets and meme stocks and what the heck happened to GameStop last week. Ben Collins at NBC is an expert in QAnon and other kinds of network conspiracies. He's often on television these days, but if you follow his Twitter and his articles, you can really learn a lot. Brandy Zadrozny is a fellow reporter at NBC with Ben. She's more on the medical misinformation beat, and so her stories will help you understand what students might be coming into contact with related to medical misinformation. Craig Silverman and Jane Levchenko at BuzzFeed both are all-star reporters that do nearly daily updates on disinformation, what's out there, and who's and how different topics are being deceived or misrepresented online. They have some excellent journalism about the U.S. as well, even though they're both stationed at BuzzFeed Canada. And then at Wired, Emma Gray Ellis also has some really great stories to help you understand more about some of the social media platforms that are not necessarily the big ones like Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. But I encourage you to follow these reporters because they can help you get up to speed very quickly around what people are seeing online and what's gaining traction. Because I think the question that someone asked earlier about just being in this environment, I would hate to suggest that anybody just go out into the wilds and try to look at misinformation or it's gross out there. I'll tell you, if you run into misinformation, you also run into anti-Semitism, misogyny, like straight up ludicrous stuff, like videos of torture, self-harm. This stuff is not for the, it just doesn't make for a good time online. And so what I would suggest is if you follow these reporters, you're going to get a good understanding of what's out there without actually having to get into the mess of it. So I want to say thank you, and I'm going to stop my share here, and then we can get into some of these questions.
Joan, thanks very much. And I'll just, speaking on behalf of VPAL, I'll just frame some of these questions for you because we're pulling a lot of different themes. Maybe the first one we're seeing, and again, please use the Q&A to contribute your questions. Let's think about a couple of different takes on the teaching question. One, if you're teaching about these issues, specifically about these movements. So how do we frame and structure discussions about far-right movements and their ideas without legitimizing what they stand for? I mean, if we create a classroom which everything is open, does that mean that nothing gets any judgment, that everything is considered to be of equal importance and equal value?
It's a good question. I try to really calibrate based on the theme of the conversation of the day to make sure that we're facilitating a discussion that is leading to the whole classroom being able to engage with it. I've had some experiences where certain students were pretty far down the rabbit hole when it comes to certain YouTube influencers and really had trouble discussing anything else. They were always trying to give me a particular point of view, which other students gave me the feedback that they found his comments to be distracting. And so as a professor, you have to intervene. And so I just, I said, hey, you stay for a minute after class. And I was just like, I get it, but also like, this isn't the turf to have that conversation. And I'm happy to meet you in office hours and go back and forth, but everybody has to learn. And so, listening to student feedback and also getting an understanding of, what's at stake if you do decide to ignore a student. You never want to get into a position where you're shaming a student for bringing something up, or into a position where you're trying to juggle too many things that you don't really know a lot about, especially when it comes to, things that can be as intricate and weird as QAnon or meme war. What you really want to do is raise the level of the conversation into a place where everyone can participate and that the discussion has some academic and scholarship value. So sometimes if someone's referencing something that's, kind of deep in the weeds on the internet, I'll say, I don't know what it is. I just don't know what it is. Like, I don't know how to talk about it. Or I'll say, if I do know what it is, I may explain to the class what it is and then say, while this is interesting, I want to go in a different direction. But it's difficult conversation to have, especially around race in this moment. We do this whole set of classes around race and algorithms. And it's really hard to get people to understand how the internet sorts information, like just getting people to understand the same basic and like baseline info about how, Google search ranks things as first, second, and third. And when you add in then discussions about bias and race and how the Google is merely sorting everything else that's already out there, so is going to incorporate human bias into it and our racism in the US in particular. It can be alarming for some students because they want to believe that somehow tech is objective or operates autonomously from the rest of us or the messiness of humans, right? And so I really try to get them to understand the mechanisms by which they're being presented information, and then do the work of getting them to realize how culture gets baked into the product. But it's a difficult thing because the other thing I don't like to do in my classroom is get into the habit of banning certain information sources. Like back in my day, they banned Wikipedia. They said, well, it's not worth it. It's not worth your time. But in the right context and in the right environment, social media, Wikipedia could be a useful piece of evidence. Of course, not in a literature review, but in other instances, yes. And so I really try to develop that critical attitude, one where we ask, and ask. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Let's just continue that. So we're getting this question of, what do you do in the classroom? You said you wouldn't ban certain sources. Would you ban certain modes of speech? There's a question that comes up. What happens if if students are saying things because they have the freedom of chat that they wouldn't feel comfortable doing if they were in person or even speaking on screen? Do you just ban chat? How would you advise someone to respond to that?
Yeah, that for me, I kept the chat. I've only taught once on, Zoom University, and it was tough. It was tough. So much of learning happens in the 20 minutes I get to class early and the hour I stay afterwards. That helps students process things. It was also really hard to calibrate my teaching because I couldn't see their inquisitive faces. Most of my students did keep their cameras on, but Harvard gave me a time slot of 7:30 a.m. on Thursdays. So it was hard, because they're sometimes just grumpy. Right? It's not that they didn't understand. It's just that they're tired. But when it comes to facilitating conversation, I try to make sure that, especially if I'm teaching a very contentious topic, that I don't just send them off into small groups. I encourage them to kind of have the conversations in front of each other to produce that kind of accountability. But you're right, chat can actually turn into a problem, especially if students start to argue with one another. And so I might make a comment in the classroom like, I can't keep up with the chat. And so sometimes that'll stop it. But for the most part, if you talk about the ground rules often and early about what we're going to count as truth in our class and what we're going to count as evidence and how we're going to understand media as part of this great power contest that we're seeing between government, tech, and some of the legacy media organizations. And then these up and comers that, apps like Parler, for instance, that are going to try to punch up in order to create market demand. And so we really just try to get students to understand that everything is contextual.
Are we down the rabbit hole and we'll never get out? One question is it possible to get out of this vortex? You've been very articulate about some of the ways that we got here. Are we ever getting out?
So it's difficult. Many of you have probably seen the movie The Social Dilemma. Now, what if I told you that actually is propaganda? That's advocacy. Psychologists from across the globe have been trying to figure out if tech addiction is the problem, and it's not. But it's a nice story, right? And it gets people to where the author of the story wants them to be, which is shutting off their devices. And so that is an unfortunate moment that we're in, where people think they're seeing research because it's packaged in a way where people who have experience creating tech products are talking about the state of the world, but they're actually, all they've done is created tech products. They actually haven't studied sociology. They haven't studied philosophy, communication, the humanities, or psychology in that case. And in doing so, we're actually moving towards a wrong proposition about the problem of disinformation and media manipulation. I've written about this for Harvard Business Review, which is essentially that media manipulation is it's a business. It begins with marketing. Politicians get involved. Everybody's got information to sell. And the other part that is more insidious is that it can move our politics. And as a result, we have to move towards a system of guardrails and oversight that make media manipulation and disinformation much less effective. That it doesn't begin with getting everyone to shut off their telephones, because most of us can't opt out. I would love to be able to opt out of Zoom all day. I feel like I'm on AOL. I'm like sitting at my desktop. I used to have much more mobility in my life. But that's all to say that we're in a moment. Maybe it's a glitch. I don't know. But getting out of the rabbit hole begins with understanding the problem accurately, and then moving towards sets of solutions that are actually very specific to the social media companies' products themselves. The bad thing about Facebook is the ease by which you can share to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. A lot of that sharing is happening in private groups. And those private groups are safe havens for radicalization, misinformation, network conspiracy. So Facebook's got to step up to the challenge, and they've started to talk about how they're going to deal with groups. Twitter's a different beast in the sense that people go on Twitter to get attention from journalists. So the intervention isn't always trying to make something not trend on Twitter, although I've recommended to Twitter that they hire, egregiously, I said 10,000 librarians, but maybe it's not enough, to handle their trending topics, so that when people are suggested information, they get timely, local, relevant, and accurate information. One of the chats is about, decolonizing the big T truth, which is, I think, also a very important point here, which is to say that we do want to have our social media ecosystem have a lever or have a way of giving us timely, local, relevant, and accurate information, both on demand, but also in steady flows. And we can look to actually the regulation around radio for some hints as to how we would do this. Back in the day, you'd put on the rock station, it would play rock music, there'd be some advertising, but there wouldn't be a DJ that would come on and say, and in local news, there's a city council meeting tonight, and there's a snow emergency. That had to be forced. That's called a public interest obligation. And so the future of our research actually is to try to think through, well, what are the public interest obligations that are going to help us get out of this moment and into a place where our media ecosystem is thriving, local, contextual, where people who have money and power aren't able to use the scale and the openness of social media to their advantage. And that's what I'm hoping our research reveals, is that we built a media ecosystem between the web and social media that is really tilted in favor of people who have money and power already. And, movements, pro-social movements for a long time had a first mover advantage because nobody cared what happened on Facebook in 2010. I dare you to go back and look at your Facebook in 2010. You were sharing maybe some cat memes. Maybe they weren't even sharing cat pictures. But that's all to say that a decade later, the internet and social media in particular have been weaponized to create very, very destructive tendencies in our democracy. And so the key isn't winding back the clock. The key isn't, shutting off our phones. The key, like all politics, is reining in the powerful and doing so in a way that is transparent and fair and clear, and then setting up new sets of rules so that the truth, which is, always slow out the gate, but is a very steady runner, the truth can get over the finish line.
This is great, Joan. We just have time for one very short question, and we are going to make available the slides and material from this session for those who are not able to attend all of it. Joan, maybe you could just leave us with 1 minute on, if you're teaching a class and you've seen this and it scares the heck out of you, what would you advise to create a classroom in which there are potentially some guardrails, and yet people listen to each other? So you don't have students saying, I'm not going to listen to you, but at the same time, not everything is appropriate for the classroom.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really about the value set you show up with on that first day of class, which is, I am soft on deadlines. I am soft on, maybe I let the discussion go on a little too long. Sometimes someone's making a comment and I can tell they haven't done the reading. We've all been there. But I try to present the material with a level of inquisitiveness that is respectful of the diversity of the classroom, and acknowledging things like, before going in to talk about hate speech, I will talk about things like the history of scientific racism and how it shows up on YouTube. Just to say that a lot of the things that we experience as problems now are not new because technology has amplified and exacerbated them. But these are essential tensions of our society that need to be resolved through examination, through research, through careful consideration. And so engendering a culture of respect. But you can kind of tell very early on in a classroom if someone's going to try to dominate the conversation or to try to steer every opportunity for discussion towards their particular pet issue. And it's really hard, especially in political science conversations, to not let that happen. But this can be as easily diffused as saying, well, let's get someone else in the conversation. Let's see what other people think. And hopefully the rest of the students will kind of do that, check with each other. I also take student complaints very, very seriously, and I let other students know that I do. So I say, if something happens in the classroom, you don't feel comfortable bringing it up, come to me. Like, let's just discuss it. We're all adults. And if something has come up that has irked you or kind of felt weird, like, let's talk about it, and err on the side of inclusive conversation rather than exclusive conversation. But it is, it's because it's in the news, it's really impossible to ignore. And so it behooves you to have a few different ways in which you deflect. Sometimes I'll model behavior from our conferences and I'll say, that's more of a comment than a question, and we'll kind of joke about it. But having some guardrails around this line about the devil doesn't need an advocate, I'll repeat that before we go into contentious discussions so that students don't think they can get, cheeky with me if they want to pose a question. Which is all to say, I think it's important that students learn not just how to assess other people's worldviews and work them out ideologically, but also it's important to knock down straw men when we see them. When it comes to this moment that we're in, the meme that all conservatives are Nazis and all, Dems are Antifa, like I just call that out in the classroom and I say, none of that is true. Joe Biden is not running on a radical agenda. And we know this. And so you just have to kind of call it out for what it is when you see it in the media and help them understand that some of these things are tropes and they're doing political work. And as scholars, our job is to not be manipulated. It's actually to be able to cut through the BS. And if you can get them there, if you can get them into a mode of truth seeking rather than feeling as if they know it already, you can get some really lively and interesting classroom discussions. I'll give you one anecdote. I know we need to shut down, but I was teaching at the Navy base in San Diego the night that they got rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it changed everything because the students in my class had desperately wanted to talk about men and affection and culture shock that they experienced when they had been deployed to Africa. And they didn't feel like they could because it was gay. Like kissing your dad was gay to them. And it's because they didn't have an environment in which they could talk about men hugging each other and showing affection to each other, because the US-centric, mode of understanding everything is, gay really had clouded their idea of how they should approach other men in public. And so I try to introduce concepts like that, stories like that, to get them to understand that culture shock isn't necessarily a bad thing. It should actually question your own assumptions. And so I'll leave you with that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody. This has been a fabulous session.
Well, Joan, thank you so much. And thank you for helping us with truth seeking. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us soon for our next signature event on February 23rd, when the safety net pays for itself. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of today's session and past ones, can be found at socializeremotely.harvard.edu. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please continue the conversation.